Hey guys, Wintermeat here, and welcome to the channel. So I recently participated in the GMTK 2020 Game Jam, and I thought I'd make a video about what I made, and some thoughts I had about the jam. If you're not familiar with game jams, they're a subcategory sorta of hackathons, where you're given a theme and a set period of time, where you have to develop a game from scratch. Of course, for different jams there are different rules, but for this one I made pretty much everything by myself except for some of the sound effects. And the theme for this jam was Out of Control. I only actually managed to start about 7 hours after the beginning of the jam, but I began by brainstorming. It's generally a good idea to spend a lot of time designing than to just wing it with the first idea you come across, since you end up wasting your time developing a terrible idea and have to restart. So I typically storyboard on paper, but I thought I'd record it with Krita this time. My idea was to make a game about positive feedback loops, loops that sort of feed on themselves and get more and more out of control. So this would be about the rain getting out of control due to your sacrifices to the Rain Sprites. This theme was largely inspired by Weathering with You, a really great anime I watched earlier this year. I also decided to make it controlled by console, by typing in commands, because that would be a fun programming problem and would also create an element of being out of control of the game world. Once I settled on a theme, I began by developing the core gameplay loop. This was an important thing to think about, as it is in most games, but especially important in a game jam. And it's basically the actions that a player will do over and over again in your game. So the idea is that you sow a plant, a random seed, on a tile, and then you feed the tile. Every day that the plant is fed, it has a probability of growing. Now, once it's done growing, you can harvest the plant and then sacrifice it to the Rain Sprites, and that's how you progress through the game. The indicators of this is that there will be a bit of story that comes in the console every day, as well as a change in the rainfall effect and some new seeds added to your inventory that you can randomly plant. I used Aseprite for the art like I usually do, and I started by making some tiles. So I used square tiles at first, but I realized that didn't look very good, and I wanted to try something that I hadn't done before because that's what game jams are for. So I tried using isometric tiles, and I think that was a good choice. Basically, it made everything look a lot more polished, and it conveyed the idea of a physical game board a lot better. I also didn't realize you needed to make perfect hexagons, so this got screwed up real quick with the tiling, and I had to kind of redo it. But anyways, quick tip if you're making isometric tiles, especially in pixel art form, make sure everything's at a 60-degree angle, or make sure each of the edges meet at 60 degrees angles and you form perfect hexagons for each of the tiles. And to create the tile variation, all I did was change the hue, saturation, and brightness values of the tiles in order to create different colors, like a fed tile, a dry tile, a stone tile, like a purple fire tile, and a water tile. Then I created a new project in Unity, imported the isometric sprite sheet, and added a simple drop shadow underneath to try to improve the isolated virtual effect. So at first I made this drop tile with several sprites, but I realized I was being dumb and I just created a single big drop shadow. Also, for the fun of it, I tried to make everything bounce, which is easy enough. I just applied a sine function of time to the vertical position of the tiles and to the scale of the drop shadow, so it would look like, as time passed, the whole tile map would move up and down, and the drop shadow would shrink as the tiles moved up. Then I created the main UI for the game. It was surprisingly simple. I just mocked up like a console shape in Aseprite and I made it sliceable. Fortunately, Unity and TextMesh Pro have a very cool text input component, a text input box, which is very useful, and I really didn't have to do too much coding on that end. I also sort of tried to clean up the scene a bit, and I experimented with a couple of different fonts to use with TextMesh Pro, but I like the hack font, so I sort of just went with that. It was really easy to get the text input module working, and I really can't overstate that, and it's one of the reasons I like working with Unity. Okay, so on to the development of the whole console thing. The first thing I added was syntax highlighting and sort of a tokenization of the input, and I came up with a really dumb idea that I ended up regretting afterwards, which was to, instead of just append text to the end of the output, I decided for some reason to refresh and reprint the whole filtered history of the console output and then crop off the top in order to make scrolling easier, which I suppose was true, but that created a ton of problems later. So I just wrote down a couple of keywords in a list and I compared those against all of the tokens or words that I was given. Things like sacrificed and harvest and such. I ran that thing through a text parser and then I just printed the text with rich text formatting, which was also built into the TextMesh Pro input component. Anyways, my decision to reprint the console every time created a whole ton of bugs, and I ended up spending quite a while to flatten all of them, but I got it working in the end, mostly. Now for the time system. Basically what it does is every 3 seconds it adds 10 minutes to the game time, and then it uses a fairly simple formula just with like modulo and subtraction and integer division. I don't know, I just kind of made it up. In order to translate from minutes to hours and days, and this let me implement my first functions in the console, which were wait and time. So what these would do is it would display the time when you typed in time, and wait would just pass 1,440 minutes, which is the equivalent of 24 hours, so it just moves from one day to the next. I created a system for the tiles, so I stored this in a 2D array. C# is a little bit weird in that it's not a bracket per dimension, but rather it's comma separated dimensions, and I've never really seen that in another programming language. Anyways, I just made a 2D array for this, and I created a tile map to store my tiles. For some reason, I started the tiles in a 1D array and then tried to loop through that to force them into a 2D map, but just because I thought that would be easier than me just labeling them, but that optimization ended up just wasting time. I also added these coordinate markers to the grid, which was actually quite useful, as it would show the player what tiles were called which ones. And with the tiles reference, I could start with some more complex console commands. So for example, what the water command does is that it reads the first keyword, and then after that, it takes in parameters. So it just splits every keyword you put in afterwards, or every token you put in afterwards. So you can say water A1, A2, A3, space separated, and then it'll just split those and apply the water effect to each of those 3 tiles, which I thought was pretty cool and very simple to implement. You'd imagine that error handling would be sort of difficult and kind of a nightmare in something as complex as a console, but I kind of just ignored any invalid commands, so yeah, that worked well enough. It's a game jam, you can get away with that. I also want to create a visual flash effect, so you know what happened to what tile, and in Unity it's kind of complicated to make delays. So I just used a simple code routine to toggle the opacity of the tile from 0 to 100, like twice in half a second, and you can see that it works, which is pretty cool and surprisingly straightforward to implement. Okay, so on to adding plants. The first thing to do, as usual, was to ignore the rules of prototyping and start by making art. I decided to create 3 phases for each plant, so you'd start from like a seed and then have a sprout version and then a mature plant, very much like in Stardew Valley. I then had to export that as a sprite sheet and then attach my plant object to every single one of the tiles, and my idea was just to toggle the opacity of the seed, and then toggle through these specific sprites through a plant controller script, which is fairly simple. I use scriptable objects, which are a very cool feature of Unity to store the plants, although you didn't really have to, and I just thought it might be helpful and fun to gain some experience with those. So how the plants work is that every day, if they are in a fed tile, at the end of the day they will have a chance of growing, and after growing twice, they are harvestable with the harvest command. I also added the plant function to the console so you can plant multiple plants in multiple tiles at once. Cool, so that's like half the gameplay loop done. I also have to add a couple other functions and also an inventory. But I didn't want the player to have control over the type of plant they would sow, mostly because that would complicate and screw up my whole text parsing system. So I kind of just picked a random plant for them to sow whenever they planted a seed in a tile. And I would add more available seeds over time as you progress through the game. I also had to make a couple of utility functions to list the kind of seeds that you had available, as well as to check your harvested inventory. So onto the raindrop effect. The idea here was that raindrops would fall at different angles and different speeds depending on your progress through the game, so that as you got further, the rain would become progressively more harsh, and I thought that would be a pretty cool visual indicator. The actual physics of this, by using like collision volumes and rigid bodies and like other dumb polygon colliders, was a complete nightmare to code, so I kind of ditched it. Unfortunately, I couldn't make the rain splash on the tiles, so it's just sort of like a screen space effect, and I wrote a simple translation function. I just specified a direction vector, and then it would just move in that direction, and it would just toggle the angle of the sprite. So here's a test at this point in the game. I have the feed function, the plant function, the harvest function, and growth in plants implemented, as well as some cool visual effects. And at this point it was like 1 AM and I headed to bed. Here's a look at my setup. After a couple hours of rest, I woke up and I got back to it in the morning. So on the checklist now was to finish off the remaining tasks, like the sacrifice function, usability improvements, more plants, general art, like a main menu, sound, and publishing to itch.io. Last year I had an annoying experience trying to build it because it kept on crashing, so I thought I'd leave a bit more time for myself in the future, which was a good idea because I ended up having the same problem with building it, and I had to restart my computer in order to make it work. So initially I wanted the sacrifice function to randomly sacrifice plants from your inventory, but I couldn't figure out how to take things out of a list that I was enumerating over without completely screwing it up. So I kind of just had the sacrifice command clear your entire inventory. And I also added a help function which would display the available commands. And this ended up messing everything up later because of how I wrote the console systems, because I'm an idiot. So a little bit more time was spent to bug fixing. I also spent a good while writing some story, and I thought this would show up in the consoles sort of like news reports every day. So I just wrote 20 of these, one for each level of rainfall intensity, and as you sacrificed harvested plants, the rain would get stronger, you gain more plants, and also maybe get a new snippet of story. The rich text highlight function came in handy, but I also screwed up pretty badly and I made the highlighting opaque on 2 of them because I typed the wrong hex code, forgot to add the opacity value, so you can't read some of the story unfortunately. The sound was going to be an integral part of this project, so I spent quite a while on it. I was going for a melancholy but cozy feel, reminiscent of a typical rainy day. Here's me and my guitar, experimenting with a couple of sad sounding chords over which I placed a simple, loopable melody. I put this together in Audacity because I really didn't know what DAW to use, but that's something I'll research before the next game jam. Then I applied some basic effects and imported it back to Unity. Back in Unity, I created a couple of audio sources in order to handle the 3 sources of sound in my game. So there would be an ambient sound source, like for the rain and the rain sound effect, and there'd be an SFX audio source for the thunder sound effect, as well as an audio source for the background music. Working with audio in Unity is actually really easy and a nice experience, so I quite enjoyed this part, and it was at this point I really felt that the project was starting to come together. So the last thing to do was to build in a main menu, so this would be the first thing the player would get to, and instead of trying to put this in a different scene and rebuild everything and make like complex scene transitions, I just moved everything off screen and I created a nice and minimalistic screen that didn't require Unity's animation system, which I hate. And instead I just used a lerp technique I figured out earlier to transition from a basic starting screen with the game board centered, a small instruction and the title of the game at the top, to a screen split between tiles and the console. Now, there are a lot of things to transition, but it's really easy by just setting a target value for a property and then using the linear interpolation function to move the property over time towards the target whenever it differed. Now all that was left to do was package up the game, which was easier said than done, and upload it to itch.io. I'm really proud of what I managed to make in less than 2 days, despite a couple of smallish bugs, and I'm really glad I joined this jam. So if you want to give this game a shot, I linked it in the description and it's completely free and playable in the browser. Play it with headphones and don't rush through it. Just relax and let yourself become immersed. It's only maybe 10 or 15 minutes long. The PC version, if you download it, is full screen, 1920 by 1080, and possibly resizable, though I don't know, and that might be preferable to the browser version. I'll also upload a full playthrough on my channel in case you want to watch me play it. Please leave a comment about what you thought, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more game dev content. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next time for the conclusion of my Elements of Motion Graphics series. Bye!